Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 421, an intro to virtue, part 1. How the power of virtue makes you the strongest man of all. The podcast objectives are provide a definition for virtue, analyze the relationship between virtue and obedience, and reveal why the realities of many within our nation never changed. This lesson contains timelines and other visuals. Therefore, if you are listening to the podcast, I advise you to watch the video version on our website or YouTube, or request a PDF of the lesson so you can add the visual effect. It was always virtue. Shalom, my beloved brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 234 of our exposition of lawlessness. In the most recent podcast, we laid a foundation for understanding the power of the set apart spirit of Elohim and its role in our lives. And as I mentioned in that podcast, the focal power of the spirit is virtue. Not only this, but virtue is the first degree of transformation you will experience in this quest. We can prove this by employing the model of the pinnacle of holiness. For the image to the left, virtue is the second level within the pinnacle of holiness. Vis-a-vis, it is the first degree which follows transformation, i.e., the critical degree of obedience. Ergo, the leading objective of transformation is to transform us into virtuous men and women. And thus, it is imperative for us to understand the power of virtue and how we can master it. By definition, virtue is moral excellence, which elicits conformity to a standard of ethical principles and produces an effective force that is able to defeat any opposing power. Now, this definition clearly reveals why virtue is the focal power of the Ruach. First and foremost, virtue cannot be defeated by any opposing force. This speaks to the indestructible nature of the Ruach. To it, virtue is the focal power that makes the set apart spirit of Elohim the most powerful force in every universe. Here again, this power is required for various occasions of spiritual warfare. That includes those occasions in which men and women in our nation need to be delivered from any form of oppression. Yahushua, our master and our example, demonstrated the power of virtue all throughout his ministry. Mark chapter 5 and Luke chapter 8 provide an account of how the virtue within Yahushua Messiah healed a woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years. Not only this, but Luke chapter 6 provides an account of one of the many events in which our master demonstrated mass healing, i.e., a healing of the masses. Luke 6:17 through 19 is revealing. And coming down with them, he stood on a level place with a crowd of his taught ones and a great number of people from all Yehuda and Jerusalem, and from the coast country of Zor and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And all the crowd were seeking to touch him, for virtue went out from him, and he was healing them all. Now, there are many takeaways from this passage, and yet I want to focus on one, which I will offer as an inflection point. This is one I advise you to bookmark if you are led. Yahushua Messiah, being filled with the Ruach and operating at a higher level of spirituality than any man before him or after him, possessed an overflow of every power of the Spirit. And yet, when it came to healing and neutralizing the forces of darkness, which were oppressing the lost sheep of Israel, the force he deployed from his vast arsenal of power was virtue. It was always virtue. They were willing to obey. Now, the association between virtue and the power of the Ruach that has been designed to overcome the forces of darkness is the second half of the equation. Ergo, we must analyze the first half to understand how we, like Yahushua Messiah, can wield so great a power. Along these lines, virtue is moral excellence, which elicits conformity to a standard of ethical principles. The key word in this line is conformity. To wit, conformity is the focal degree of obedience. And when you combine conformance with compliance, you get transformation. And this, my friends, is yet another witness to the linear model of holiness. To wit, where there is no obedience, there can be no virtue. You can see this by observing the image to the left. Vis-a-vis, obedience is the bridge that connects the levels of faith and virtue. Ergo, when Peter commanded us to add virtue to our faith, he was commanding us to walk in obedience. For obedience is the primary application and affliction of faith. My dear friends, we have already proven this matter, and yet we can harden this truth by considering a powerful occasion of healing found in the book of Acts. If you would, I ask you to pause the podcast and take a few minutes to read Acts 5:12 through 42. Now, as the story goes, the disciples demonstrated mass healing in the name of Yahushua Messiah. This, ironically, caused the priests to be filled with jealousy. And so they put the disciples into the common prison while commanding them not to teach in the name of Yahushua Messiah. That same night, a messenger of Elohim appeared to his disciples in prison. And after opening their prison doors, he commanded them to go back into the set apart place the next day and declare the wonderful words of this life. Now, it is important for you to understand this situation for what it is, vis-a-vis the high priests and leaders who put the disciples in prison were the same villains responsible for impaling Yahushua Messiah a few weeks before. And thus, by obeying the messenger of Elohim, the disciples were clearly putting their lives at risk. We know this because the priests sought to slay them after they returned to the temple. And the only reason they didn't kill them is because they feared the people. And yet, the disciples at the time of their release were not aware of this. And yet, they obeyed. And in doing so, they confirmed their mastery of obedience and faith by declaring, "We have to obey Elohim rather than men." What courage, what valor, what devotion to Elohim. These men were willing to be faithful and obedient unto death. And this, my friends, is why they were able to heal the masses. It is because they, like Yahushua Messiah, were men of virtue. And we know this because they, even in the face of death, were willing to obey. We must become the strong man. Now, as amazing as this story is, it is also the antithesis of what we have largely seen within the extended nation of Israel in these last days. To wit, we are not seeing demonstrations of the power of the Ruach, at least not as we should. Along these lines, power is a focal theme of the restoration message. Ergo, power should be a focal feature of everyone who has heard and is living according to this message. We should be harnessing the power of this message. My dear friends, you must believe me. This is the only way we will escape the curse of this captivity. It is for the following reason, which I will offer as an inflection point. This is one I advise you to bookmark and to share. If you walk in accordance to the restoration message, you will unlock the power to transform your life to reflect the Father's goodwill. To wit, all the amazing acts of love, compassion, and peace he has promised to perform on behalf of the renewed nation of Israel. But alas, here lies the inflection and the problem. And I have said it again and again and again. And I will keep saying it as long as Yahuwah commands me, in hope that some soul should heed this warning and repent. There is no working power in hearing the restoration message. Quite the contrary. The power within this message is only activated as you walk in accordance to the message. And you cannot walk in accordance to the message if you have not unlocked the powers of obedience and faith. For it is impossible to become doers of the word if you are not operating in the spirit of obedient faith. Now, that was the inflection. Here is the problem. Vis-a-vis, many within our nation are not interested in transforming themselves into doers of the word. Why? It's because there is affliction in obedience. Yahuwah designed it this way. Remember, obedience as the primary application of faith is the greatest and most prominent test of our faith in Elohim. Ergo, the only way to validate your great faith in Elohim is by being pressure tested in situations where obeying the commands of Elohim is difficult. It is physically demanding. It is stressful. Why? Because obedience is challenging every fabric of your being that is not aligned with the precepts of faith, i.e., hope, trust, and reliance. My dear friends, I beseech you, don't think this development is somehow strange. As I said before, Yahuwah designed it this way. Why? It's because he knows that the only way we can become men and women of great faith is if we first prove ourselves as men and women who are able and willing to endure great affliction. Facts. Now, I ask you to consider the disciples. They were threatened, beaten up, and thrown into prison, and they still walked in obedience to the word they were given. Trust me, many of us have never and will never endure what they endured. Neither will we endure what our master endured. Despite the fact that we have been oppressed for many years, we as a nation are not presently under the pain of death for guarding the commands of Elohim. This brings us to the question of the hour, vis-a-vis, how will we inherit the destiny of our master and his disciples if we refuse to obey him in simple matters that carry no pain of death? The sure answer is we can't. Alas, we will neither inherit their destiny nor their reality. Now, the destiny factor speaks for itself. Let me tell you something. If you want to disobey, no one is stopping you. And yet, I am warning you, don't kid yourself. You will not have everlasting life. It will never be yours. Listen to me. I'm trying to help you. Elohim is a mighty one of justice. And it is not justice for those who refuse to walk in obedient faith to his will to enter the reign of the heavens with those who endured great affliction to guard each and every one of his commands. As I have said before and often, if you are unwilling to pay the full price of the ticket, there is no seat for you on this train. Facts. This brings us to the reality factor. Let's talk about it for a while, shall we? Now, first things first, if you actually read the text, then you understand there is a drastic change in the reality of those who are being restored unto Elohim in these last days. Now, to sum it up, I'd advise you to look at all the blessings in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and consider this is the reality of all who have truly embraced the restoration message and are guarding the commands of Elohim. This is our reality. On the other hand, I advise you to look at all the curses found in Deuteronomy 28 and consider this is the reality of all who have heard the message and yet are refusing to guard the commands of Elohim. This is their reality. Here again, this is nothing you should think to be strange. Why? It's because this was their reality before the restoration began. And the only reason why the reality has not changed is because they had not unlocked the power of the restoration message. And we know why. It's because they are not men and women of virtue. To wit, they cannot harness the power of virtue to transform their reality because they are not operating in obedience or faith. My dear friends, you must believe me. You will never operate in the power of virtue if you are not operating and the powers of obedience and faith. This is why you find the disciples telling the priests, we have to obey Elohim rather than men. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, you must believe this word. We have to obey Elohim. And you are most wise if you take the option to disobey off the table. Listen to me. Don't even let disobedience be an option. If you recall, disobedience, more than any other degree, depletes you of your spiritual strength. Whether you realize it or not, the weakest man or woman among us is the one who disobeys. Satan knows this, and it is why he invests his greatest efforts in attacking our faith. For as I have said before, where there is no faith, there can be no obedience. And if the enemy can keep you from being obedient, he can make himself the strong man in your life. Mark 3:27 is revealing, no one is able to enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, and then he shall plunder his house. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, the enemy is the strong man in this passage. And for many hundreds of years, he has bound the descendants of Jacob. He has plundered our nation. He has destroyed our people. Why? It is because for the full duration of our captivity, he has been stronger than us. Why? It's because we have been operating in lawlessness. And this is the only reason we were being oppressed, for we were outside the goodwill of our Elohim. But now we are being restored unto our Eloah, our Father in creation. And by adhering to the restoration message, we have become the strong man, and the enemy can no longer plunder our nation or our homes. My dear friends, this is how we reverse the curse of our captivity. It is by becoming the strong man. It is by unlocking the power of virtue so we can tear down every stronghold the enemy has formed in our lives and within our nation. And here is why this is so important. Every physical form of oppression, sickness, or death in your life is a derivative of a spiritual stronghold. Ergo, the only way to eliminate these physical maladies is by eliminating the spiritual stronghold situated at the source. And this requires a strong man. To wit, it requires a man who hath unlocked the power of virtue. Now, if you don't believe this, I honestly don't know why you will continue to listen to these podcasts. I'm telling you, this is a major inflection point in our quest and a prominent dividing line within our nation. And thus, if you are not committed to being a man or woman of virtue, you will receive nothing I have to say from now. And if you are on the fence, let me tell you something. You're not going to find any form of permanent relief in this life if you are not operating in the power of virtue. My beloved brothers, you will not be able to keep the enemy out of your homes. Now, I trust that is not the man you want to be. And so I encourage you to stay with me, and I will show you how you can become the strong man in your house. By the Ruach, I will show you the path to reigning with a hand of power so you can keep the enemy out. Now, here is the final word. It's not a matter of right or wrong. What matters most is that you remain strong. Brothers and sisters, you must believe me. Our physical realities are established upon our spiritual realities. And the only way we can take control of our spiritual realities is by wielding the powers of the Ruach to defeat the enemy in spiritual warfare. Thanks to Elohim, we have been given this opportunity, an opportunity our forefathers did not possess in this land. Alas, they were subjected to the full extent of the curse of this captivity and the disastrous time of the Gentiles. But now, Yahuwah has begun to restore a remnant of our people in spirit and in truth. And the truth is, we cannot be restored to him if we do not address the spiritual source that perpetuated our captivity. And this is one of many reasons why we need his spirit. Trust me, you are not going to defeat the kingdom of darkness in any battle if you have not unlocked the powers of the set apart spirit of Elohim. And if you fail to defeat him in battle, your spiritual reality remains unchanged, as does your physical reality. You are yet under a curse. Heretofore, I recommend, don't let the enemy continue to reign in your life. You be the strong man. And after you gain the power to change your reality, never come this way again. Now, here is today's assignment. Meditate on the word you have heard today. And as always, ask the Father to reveal the truth to you. For the children of Elohim live by conviction. And if he has not convicted you, or if you have not heard him concerning these matters, you should pray until you do. Today, I want you to meditate on the word I have shared. Specifically, I want you to consider what it will take for you to become the strong man or woman in your home. And as there was a great deal of material covered, that is the only assignment for today. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 421, an intro to virtue, part 1. And the next podcast is entitled End Times 422, an intro to virtue, part 2. I will post this podcast on Friday, February 21st, 2025. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the spirit of Elohim. Continue to watch, continue to pray, continue in fasting, and most of all, continue to be focused, for the end is coming. The end is near.